of data collection. Just to say this session will be recorded, and thank you for starting the recording. My name is Amy Elhadi. I'm a program evaluation specialist with LOD. I focus on work around community assessment, qualitative data collection, and so on. So let me start sharing my screen. All right, so is everyone seeing my screen? Just give me a hint. All right. So today's presentation, it's towards an inclusive community assessment. And before I start this presentation or dig deeper into the presentation, I want to highlight three main things. I guess many people already know that, but it's also for me to help me structure the way I think about things. So approach is the general framework and direction. In this case, we're talking about inclusive community assessment. That's an approach. Could be a needs assessment, will be an approach. So that's the bigger umbrella that we're talking about today. Method is the process and steps, and that can be, let's say you want to do a community assessment, you want to go about it quantitatively or qualitatively or using mixed methods. And that's also have been covered during this week. And then the techniques will be the way or the strategy or the specific activity, survey, discussion groups, interviews. So in an approach of inclusive community assessment, you might have one or two methods or mixed methods, and then you might have several techniques to collect your data. So what's a community? We talk about community assessment. This is a simple definition for a community. Group of people living together, they share some characteristics. But and this characteristic can be language, experience, socioeconomic status, maybe, so on and so forth. There are many things that the community can or may not share, but they share some characteristics. But the reality is not all experiences are the same, even within the same community. And this picture is really beautiful. It's not beautiful in the disparities that it shows, of course, but what I'm saying is it shows you the approximate closeness of these two neighborhoods, yet they might share, let's say, the same school or market or health services and so on and so forth. But apparently from the picture, and that's only the picture, that these are completely two economic, at least different neighborhoods or different areas, but they still might be defined as a community. Maybe they share the same zip code or postal code, or maybe not. And sometimes within the same communities, you see disparities. What I'm trying to emphasize here with this picture is everyone's experience might be different. Even within the neighborhood that looks similar in this picture, the well-off or wealthier neighborhoods and the less advantaged neighborhoods, even within these neighborhoods, every individual within that neighborhood might have a different experience. And today's presentation, I'm talking about an inclusive approach to community assessment. And before I dig deeper, I just want to give a little bit of background about this approach. This this approach, myself and a friend and a graduate of OSU met in a class. Her name is Fali Mazambuka, originally from Malawi. We were talking about how can we assess community needs. Our intention was more to focus on gender and women issues and women needs and gender approach towards needs assessment and community assessment. So we're digging deeper into resources. We see needs assessment, we see community assessment, asset assessment, all these different approaches. Then we came across a theory, or it's called access mechanism theory. It might be more familiar to people who are in rural sociology field, but it's an access mechanism theory. And then we put together this inclusive approach to community assessment. I must say it haven't been tested in a big field. It has been presented several times in national and international conferences, but it hasn't been tested at a large scale. I did test this tool within a small community, the Sudanese community here in Columbus, but that's about the testing for the tool itself. But I'm bringing this up just to highlight that it's a collection of different approaches put together by two people, myself and my friend Fali. As I talk about these approaches, I will explain each approach separately and how we ended up putting this approach together. In our resources, if you go to our LOD website, you might find the resources under gender responsive asset-based approach to needs assessment, because as I said, our intention at the beginning was to address gender needs. When we got to develop the approach and we were done from developing it and testing it, we realized we're really being more inclusive. It's more than just gender. It's a very inclusive approach to assess community needs and assets. So the traditional needs assessment is an approach where you address the community problem, issues, concerns, and try to identify the gap. These are your problems. That's where you need to be. What's the gap? And you try to, these are your needs. And for those who attended my presentation, this glass might be familiar, but I love this picture that with traditional needs assessment, you're identifying problem, needs, issues, concerns, problems within the community, and you try to address each or all or one of them or so on. There are advantages and disadvantages of using each and any of these approaches, but with the needs assessment, as we move on now in a little bit to talk about asset assessment, you are being more, you focus more on also the positive parts of the community and the assets available for each and every community. And this half empty, half full glass gives a picture or idea when we talk about asset needs assessment versus just a traditional needs assessment. Within the asset-based approach to needs assessment, you identify the gifts, assets, resources that are available for the community, but you also identify problems, needs, issues, concerns, and you try to solve problems. Most of the time, ideally, would be to rely on less external resources. This approach is very useful and very, we generally in LD and personally, I advocate for this approach. you will find resources shared in this presentation, but Jim Alstold is the author of the Acid-Based Approach to Needs Assessment book. I don't know the exact name of the book, but that's the idea. The Acid-Based Approach to Needs Assessment is basically blending in these two approaches, the needs and the assets, and putting them together into an approach to identify both. Traditionally, there were approaches that looked only at the assets and positive parts of the community. There are approaches that looks only at the negative parts, but he blended this together into the asset-based approach to needs assessment in a very beautiful way in that book. And I'll move on just to explain, if you want to conduct an asset-based approach to needs assessment, there are several ways to do that, but one way is to conduct a group discussion. In that group discussion, and I'm saying that's just one technique, you can use so many other things. You can use statistical data from census, you can use any secondary data that was already available in the community, and then you can also conduct your assessment. But one way to kind of start this discussion and this approach is to have a discussion group with two groups of people. One group will be assigned to identify assets within your community, and another group will be assigned to identify needs and concerns, problems within the community. Then those two groups come together, and I'm talking about groups of each group maybe each group might be of a size of 10 to 12, 15 people maximum maybe. And they identify assets, needs, they exchange their lists, and then they come together as one group for discussion. And before we go here, I want you to maybe type in the chat box some assets available for your community, any community, the community you live in or you work in or community you have lived in. What would you think are these assets? Assume or imagine you're in one of these group discussions. You were called by OSU Extension in that specific county to participate in the discussion group. And you got asked, please identify some assets in your community. What would be these assets? Just write, or feel free to unmute your mic and just say something. Diverse population, I love that one. Existing coalitions. Strong manufacturing base. Tourism. Plenty of healthcare. Beautiful. And I like these examples that you all shared, because there are things, for example, that are tangible, such as the healthcare, right? You can say I have 1, 2, 3 hospitals. This is the quality. But I like that people have the mindset to think of things that are not tangible, such as diverse population, or these are things sometimes might be neglected by some people, diverse population, maybe vibrant youth, so on and so forth. These things are also important and very good assets to consider while you're conducting your group discussions. And as you ask people to identify assets, in the process, you will find resources in our website. I'll just highlight here. You ask people to identify individual, like the way we just did it, for example, we clustered. We already said healthcare. But as you work with your group and facilitate the discussion, ask them to list, is it individual or one thing? Like, say specifically, we have this healthcare clinic or this hospital, and so on and so forth. So to allow for more listing of assets, and then your next step will be group these things together in clusters or groups. So healthcare, education, population, and so on and so forth. But it's advised you start by listing one asset at a time, and then together the group will put things, group things together. But just allow for more broad and more listing of assets available. Because if you just list healthcare or education system, but what's in this education system, then the other group would be asked to identify issues, concerns, problems, needs within their community. Again, I'll ask you in the chat box to share or unmute yourself if you like, some issues, concerns, needs in your community. Oh, sorry. Is there anything in the chat box? I'm not seeing. Right, here we go. Oh, thanks, Debbie. Debbie shared some tools.
Oh, good.
Lack of consistent recycling, high percentage of drug addiction, limited access to health care, more transportation methods. Wonderful. So, poor transportation, limited access to food. Beautiful. So as you work with your community, again, you follow the same approach. You ask people to identify a problem in particular, and then you group these problems together in which cluster you think they fit. Then people by then have created lists. You have two groups in two different rooms or two different spaces. They've created lists, then they exchange lists. So you will give the group, the asset group, the list that has the concerns, and the other group will have the, anyway, the exchange lists, right? They exchange lists and they start discussing, adding to the list what was seen by the asset group as missing from the other group and so on. They add to their list, they come together as one group, the big group comes together, and then they start discussion. From there, can take it to how to leverage on the resources you have and assets you have, how to solve certain problems, what might be ideas of projects, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying that this is a good way to start and get to know your community. On its own, it cannot be a full, that's it, you do this and then you're done. You dig deeper after you get there, but this is a basic and very important step for you to get to know your community. And a tip for you, if you have a small group, always start with assets. And I'll tell you why. It's a little bit difficult for people to change their mindset of thinking of problems and issues and concern. So if you have the same group and it's a small group, you only have 10 people, you can't split them into two groups, start with assets. Because if you start with needs and problem, the mindset will be difficult to change to that positive mindset. So start with the positive, then move on to the problems and concerns and issues. And even during facilitating this discussion, I did facilitate both type of discussion, assets or needs. I found it a little bit difficult to brainstorm and think more about assets than it is about needs. You ask people about your needs, problems, concern in the community, they just list them very fast, one after another. Ask about assets, that's when you kind of because people don't see these positive things about their community, and especially communities that have been perceived all the time as problematic and they have issues and concerns, then the mindset just doesn't shift to that positive mindset. So again, this specific technique, because I know that I'm covering 3 different and wide, broad approaches. This specific technique, acid-based approach to needs assessment, Jim Alstold is one of the good books for this resource. And then the next approach that I'm going to talk about is where myself and my friend blended together other theories to this, basically this approach of addressing community or needs and assets. Any question? Should I move on? All right. All right. And here is where we get to the inclusive approach to acid, I can't even read it, it's long, right? Inclusive approach to acid-based approach needs assessment. I think I shouldn't have wrote approach 2 times. Anyway, inclusive approach to acid-based needs assessment. And that's where blended all these together. The needs assessment and the acid assessment that we just talked about, they were blended already by Jim Alstold, and then the access mechanism. And because access mechanism might not be familiar to many people, I'll just talk a little bit about access mechanism and what are access mechanisms. It's in every community or every society, you have mechanisms that are either allowing people to use or benefit from certain things, or hindering and blocking people from using or benefiting from certain things in the society. And one of these mechanisms might be right-based mechanism. And these are laws, customs, convention. These are things that people, if they follow, or if they don't follow, then there is penalty, whether that is by law or by if it's a tribal law or a written law, but there is penalty for people not following that specific rule agreed by a group, either a government, as I said, tribe, community, and so on. So these are rules, laws, and so on. But there are also structural mechanisms of access. And these mechanisms might be mediated by political or economic constraints. And with that, we think of things like maybe infrastructure, access to internet, these kind of things. These are access mechanisms, structural mechanisms of access. Then we have relational mechanisms. And these are not laws, but these are cultures and norms of the people. So people might be allowed, or they have the right, right? They have the right to inherit lands in some societies or communities, for example. The woman has the right to inherit land, but the culture and the norm will prevent her from inheriting that piece of land. This is not law, but it's culture and cost or norm. Or there is a market available for everyone to go there, but maybe certain group of people, it's not traditionally acceptable for those people to go to these places. So these are the norms of the society. So as we move, I'll just give some example. And an online training in a town where internet connectivity is a problem. So in the chat box, share, do you think this is right-based, structural, or relational mechanism of access? Or just you can open your mic and say what you think. Yes, this is a structural, exactly. This is a structural mechanism of access. We move on, look at this example, and what do you think that is? Mm-hmm. It's relational, exactly, because there is no law that prevents LGBTQ from using that space, but it's relational, exactly. And then this is my last example.
Well, I'm gonna call it right-spaced.
Did I hear someone saying something and I missed that?
I think I heard somebody say it too, Amy.
All right, I see right-based. Right-based, okay. Any other ideas? If I give you a hint and say, aha, I see someone saying right-based and structural-based, yes. Because the way I think it is, yeah, structural too, exactly. So as we can see that the only one, it shouldn't be one or another, right? It's a structural based because it's right based at the beginning because you have to have the right to sell in that market. But also it's the cost and expense and this makes it structural too. So with that, that's my introduction to the mechanisms of access. As I move on, I know I'm saying too many things in a very short period of time. When I had to deliver this, honestly, it was in a workshop, hours workshop. So I'm trying to put together 4 hours worth of training to 1 hour, but here I'm giving you the ideas and the hints and the way you can just navigate, or maybe it's not necessarily using this specific technique in particular, but just an eye-opener to people. Like if you think of these mechanisms, how would that make you look differently at the assets and resources you already have? So the technique to go about this is very similar to what I just explained, because as I told you, we're blending the asset-based approach to needs assessment with the access mechanism to make this approach that we call it inclusive approach to assessing communities. It's very close. You have the same group, two groups. First group identifying assets, and then but you don't just identify assets at this point. You ask more questions, and I'm giving some examples of questions you can ask. Who's benefiting or mostly benefiting from the mentioned assets, and who cannot benefit from the mentioned assets. And here you're trying to get into the access mechanism. So this access mechanism might make some particular group of people more privileged than others in the way in which they can benefit from these available assets or resources available to them. So that's where you dig deeper into, let's say you find that you have a public library available. It's an asset. Everyone has the right to use the public library, but then you dig deeper and you find that, oh, you have some structural mechanisms here blocking some people from using the library. And this structural mechanism might be the distance. This library is located in a very maybe far area from certain neighborhoods where they don't have public transportation, and also might be the cost of transportation. And they might be also relational mechanisms there. This library is located in all white neighborhood where a black kid might not feel comfortable using that library because they will be the only black kid in that library, for example. There's no law that prevents the kid from attending, using, or benefiting from the library, but it's these kind of things you need to look at. Then you have your other group at the same time identifying issues, concerns, and problems. And with problems, it gets a little bit tricky, but also dig deeper and see who's impacted by the identified concern or asset the most. Maybe there's a water problem in that specific community, but maybe some parts of the community are impacted more than other parts of the community by this water problem. Maybe some parts of the community are capable of buying, I don't know, bottled water. That's not a good example, but anyway, and some others they can't afford. So you need to dig deeper into understanding even that concern or that problem, who's impacted the most by this problem and by this concern. And here I'll give an example of when this approach was used. There was a community center established for a specific community, a migrant community. The community center was laid out or meant to be used by all members of this migrant community, all women, men, children, everyone in the migrant community. And it's a space for cultural events and so on. What happened is, after a few weeks of having that community center, people or only men occupied that space. Then came the question is like, why only men? This place is available. Women can use it. There's no problem or no law that says women cannot use that space. It just suddenly became a men's space. Then using this approach, talking to the community and digging deeper into why women were not using this space. What's the problem here? Then you come to the relational aspects, which you can't see if you don't dig deeper and get to know these access mechanisms. So that community is not very or extremely conservative, yet there is a little bit of discomfort when the space is occupied by men all the time playing cards or using it as their entertainment or drinking coffee or so on and so forth. So women find it a little bit difficult for them to get into that space that's used by men only. So no woman wanted to be the one who's just getting into the space and using it, even not a couple of women or 3 or 4. After that discussion, the space changed completely, or the ideas of using the space changed completely from just a space to, okay, talking to women, here are the ideas. We want to use this space during daytime. We have skills within the community. Some women wanted to return to school or do further education. And then some other women are offering childcare support, for example. So, okay, daytime, this space can be used for childcare support. These are ideas. I'm saying these are the ideas. It's not being implemented, but these are ideas for the use of the space. Another idea was, okay, women just as men, they want to come and gather and have some fun and do some activities, but the space is always occupied by men. So, okay, how about having the space used alternating days, a day for men, a day for women, and a day is another day open for both men and women to use and families to gather and so on. And then days for youth and different hours. So these are the things that, without digging deeper into the mechanisms and the skills of people, with that we got to know assets. People have certain skills that they want to participate in making this space better, and then we got to understand why this community, how this community will benefit from the space, and not only men turning it to a play space or a gathering or discussion or something. If you have any ideas you think you might use the approach, I'll share one more story. I presented this in an international conference, and someone came to me or shared her story. She said, wow, that's incredible, because it took us very long time after there was a farmer's market in a place, and then we noticed only men were using the place, the farmers market. Only men were attending the farmers market, but it took them really long time to realize the problem. The problem was the farmer market exists, but then there were no appropriate, there were no actually facility for restrooms. So women avoided coming to the farmers market because there's no facility or no appropriate restrooms. And then things like that would be more. My internet is my internet okay? I see. I'm reading I have connectivity issues. I hope I don't.
You're all right, Amy. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So these are the kind of things you identify as you dig deeper into, not just I have this asset or I have this problem. If you have some stories you want to share, ideas of when there are certain mechanisms that allowed some people or prevented some people from using something or benefiting from something. If you have any ideas, just feel free to share them or type them or speak or. Examples can be from your community you're working in, community you've lived in. All right, maybe you open up for discussion later if people don't have ideas now. So my thoughts of why use an inclusive approach for community assessment. You need to understand the root causes of the issues and problems you have. It's not just my problem, women are not coming to this place, or my coming to my programs in the language I understand, for example. Are the programs offered in a location where they can access? Are the programs offered at a time where they are available? Maybe women are available certain times, men are available at other times because of care work women have to do around households and things like that. So you have to understand the root causes of your problem. And this will make you look into your community differently. And then understand the power dynamics. The power dynamics is very important in every community work. There are dynamics within every household. There are power dynamics within communities, and so on. So understand the power dynamics in play. And then mobilize your communities. As communities come together and talk, they create and generate ideas. You are not the expert who can solve the problems of the world, even though we hope or we wish or we have the intentions to do that. Impact you're leaving in the community. You leave a more lasting impact when communities are engaged in the discussion, when communities are participating in the process of the development. You leave a more impactful programs when communities are engaged and involved and taking the lead, not only engaged and involved, but taking the lead. And then you utilize the resources you have. Certain resources are available, but we don't tend to think about the resources available. Skills available, we don't think of these skills. All these are important to look at, and for you to look at this, you need to look deeper. And I'm saying again, this is just one technique way that two graduate students came together and thought about an approach, but the main idea is look into your community. Whatever approach you use, look beyond what you have and what you do not have in your community, addressing everyone's need. That's the main point. I see Debbie Custer is sharing here. Families, children not having access to internet connection due to living in more rural part of the community county. This prevents children from participating in online education or ability to look up information for assignments. Exactly. That's exactly the kind of problems in certain communities. And this is a structural based mechanism, right? My brain always goes into these three dimensions. Thanks for sharing. And with that, I'm done with today's presentation. I've listed here Fali, she's a graduate from OSU as well. She's working now as a postdoctoral associate, University of Georgia. And then here are the references used to put this approach together. And I'll just have time for discussion. Maybe ideas, thoughts. Do you think what was shared today is useful? Do you think there is something, you learned something about this? Something new, or it's just there's nothing new there? Do you think you will use or might use this approach in the future, any type of discussion. So I allowed more time this time for people to interact and talk. And thank you.